Welcome back. We're going to return to our biggest story. The biggest anti-government protests in Iran in almost a decade. The rallies in more than a dozen towns and cities across the country have turned the spotlight on President Hassan Rouhani's economic record. Despite the easing of international sanctions as part of the nuclear deal, people in many parts of the Islamic Republic haven't seen much improvement in their daily lives. CNN's Amir Daftari has the story.
Unemployment, inflation, corruption. The triggers for deadly protests across Iran. The government has acknowledged these economic challenges.
What is clear is that these threats and challenges have to be turned into opportunities.
But words haven't been enough. In fact, the protests have spread. With frustrations over the economy growing into wider discontent about the overall state of politics. Many Iranians had higher expectations for their country. This was the scene just 2 years ago. Young men and women cheering Iran's nuclear deal with world powers, hopeful that an end to years of economic sanctions would bring a more prosperous future. There have been some improvements. Growth has returned and inflation has fallen. The International Monetary Fund says the economy is set to expand by 4.2%. Iran's crude oil is being sold overseas once again. And foreign investment is starting to trickle back as well. France's oil giant Total and China's CNPC agreed to invest billions of dollars to develop a giant gas field. But many Iranians are not feeling the benefits. Daily life remains hard, and there aren't enough jobs, especially for the young. The unemployment rate for those aged 15 to 29 is around 25%. At the same time, the government's new budget is set to cut infrastructure spending and cash subsidies, while allocating millions of dollars for religious institutions. So while Iran's economic indicators are positive, the government needs to find a way to translate them into higher living standards, and fast. Amir Daftari, CNN.
Well, of course, adding to the economic woes of the country, a military operation in war-torn Syria. Well, for more on the protesters' grievances and the government response, I want to bring in Ellie Geranmayeh. She is a policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and joins me now from London. Great to have you with us, Ellie.
Thank you for inviting me.
At the end of the day, how much of the unrest and the problems we're seeing is about money? The fact that many people can't buy basic supplies like eggs and milk, and the fact that unemployment is rising. Did people there expect to have a windfall when the nuclear deal was signed?
Well, certainly when the protests started back last week, they were sparked by slogans to do with the economic frustrations of those chanting on the streets. Now, they've evolved into something more to do with socio-political grievances as well, but the initial trigger were these economic woes. And yes, there was high expectation inside the country, which is largely youth demographic, that after the sanctions easing brought about by the nuclear deal, there will be greater trickle-down effect. Now, that hasn't quite translated into the way that both the Rouhani government envisaged and also the other world powers who signed the deal, because coming out from sanctions, almost 10 years of unprecedented sanctions, has also unprecedented consequences in terms of how easy it's been for international investors to go back into Iran and for also domestic policies inside the country to reform.
And looking at the political fallout, we're seeing factions in both Iran and the US using these protests to score some political points. Many in Washington, of course, urging President Trump to get tough on Iran by using the nuclear deal. Let's just take a listen to what Republican Lynda Kinkade had to say.
It's not enough to watch. President Trump is tweeting very sympathetically to the Iranian people, but you just can't tweet here. You have to lay out a plan. And if I were President Trump, I'd lay out a plan as to how I would engage the regime.
Well, Senator Graham there says President Trump should push for a better nuclear deal rather than shy away from wading into this crisis. How likely is it that he will actually do something more than just something that just involves a tweet?
Well, it's been incredible to watch how many political pundits in Washington, D.C. have become Iran experts over the weekend based on these protests. But certainly, these protests in Iran come at a very sensitive time for the nuclear deal, where in the coming days, we're expecting a decision to be made by the U.S. administration on whether they certify Iranian compliance to Congress and also waive international sanctions. Now, the prevailing consensus was that the Trump administration wouldn't take action that would undermine the deal and offer a death blow, but that's always within the mandate. And there's a lot of pressure, particularly by those in the establishment in the U.S. that have advocated for regime change in Iran, for him to pull out of the deal or negotiate some sort of unicorn better deal. That pressure will likely build up as a consequence of these protests inside Iran.
In a recent policy briefing, you wrote that Europe should not only try to preserve the nuclear deal with Iran, it should also make contingency plans to salvage the relationship with Iran if the US defects. Just briefly, is it even possible for Europe to unilaterally preserve the deal if the US is determined to ditch it?
Well, as the report also caveats, this would be an extremely difficult task, but it would essentially be a political task for governments in Europe, particularly those who are parties to this nuclear deal, to make a political choice of whether they want to abide by commitments that they've signed by or follow quite unreasonable behavior from the US side to unilaterally renege from it. And essentially, there are tactics that Europeans have used before to politically and also legally push back against US measures that undermined European foreign policy. And in our report, we looked at some of those options.